Okay, all righty. So this slide kind of sums it all up. That's me. When Maria called to ask me to talk on pop knowledge about the years I spent growing up on the Crow Reservation, it gave me pause. I'm always surprised that people are interested in our family's life there and the influences that life had for us. Um, there's some part of me that tends to think of our past as very ordinary. And then I remember we had an opportunity that was unusual in our generation. We were privileged to experience a time of transition that had passed many years before in the more urbanized parts of America. Uh, just to give you a little locational, and I'm probably going to give you a little tiny history lesson too, just bear with me, but it's important to understand the impact on our childhood there. So this is where the Crow Reservation is. It'll be somewhat familiar to Dave. He was saying that he had done some work down there. It's a sizable reservation, and the lands there are vast. There's not a lot of towns. There's just land, a lot of land. We were lucky because it's probably one of the more splendid parts of Montana. And those of you who might be from Western Montana may not understand that there are mountains and just these sweeping spaces there. What most people don't know is that there was a time when this reservation was many times this size. It extended all the way over to Livingston and down to the middle of Wyoming, including a big swath of Yellowstone Park. We really didn't know that either. While you were there, you just don't think about the past as much as you think about the days you're living in right then. It's a sweeping landscape, and I know I said that before, but it has a lot of water in it. Again, Dave will be familiar with some of these creeks, I'm sure. It sits in lands that have always been Crow country. Before it was even reservation, it was Crow country. That's where they hunted. They lived pretty much their entire life there. There are several branches of the Crow tribe, so they came and went, but this was good hunting country, good water country, and fairly sheltered in the more severe times of the year. You'll find some of the highest mountains in the state there. A lot of people don't really know that. And then the valleys are very lush because there's just a lot of water, as you can see from this breakout here. And even though there were lots of people farming and ranching there, our history was a little bit different than some because we were there for so many generations on the reservation. I think it's important to pinpoint that because if you come new to the reservation, a lot of times you don't realize that you're really coming to another country. We had all the usual ranching activities. It happened that my father raised sheep, so our lives were a little different than those people who were raising cattle. Probably the big difference is when we went to some of the cow camps, or some of the sheep camps really, we lived like people of another century. There are towns on the reservation. There are what I would call 3 major towns, and then a few little townlets, like maybe a wide spot in the road. There are Crow Agency, which is where the actual offices and whatnot of the tribe are. There's Pryor, and there's Lodgegrass. A lot of people think Hardin is on the reservation, but as a county seat, it sits slightly off the reservation, right on the border. And for the most part, unless you travel the interstate going to Denver or to the eastern part of the United States, you might not ever have reason to pass through that country there. To talk about our early years in that situation, let me go back just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about how we came to be on the reservation. Our grandparents, Bill and Emma Lynde, moved there from Gillette, Wyoming, to what was a new railroad stop on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line in 1913. They brought with them my great-grandparents, so that's why we talk about 4 generations of our family living on the reservation. The building that you're looking at, this is the best picture I've got of it, and I wish it was better, but it's a livery stable, and it was originally a livery stable that was built by my grandfather because he figured that the real business would be for him to supply a place for people to leave their horses when they got on that new train. So people would come to town, as it will in Lodgegrass, Montana, and contract with Bill to keep their horse while they went to one of the big cities like Billings or Sheridan or even Hardin. So he boarded horses. He also indulged his skills in buying and selling horses because the Crow people really, really love their horses, and they raise some of the most beautiful horses in the state. As our dad got older, he spent a lot of time in the livery, but he also did a lot of other odd jobs and eventually ended up working on some ranches in the area. As he became an adult, he took on more aspects of cowboying. He looks more like a cowboy there. And he eventually encountered my mother at a country dance outside of Hardin, Montana. So you're looking at those two people in their early years. And by this time, my grandfather had bought a ranch about 3 miles outside of Lodgegrass, and our parents and grandparents were living there from the time they were fairly early in their marriage. My great-grandparents stayed in the town of Lodgegrass, so they were more inside of the town. My grandfather worked for the school kind of as a maintenance man, or my great-grandfather, and my great-grandmother was the town midwife. So that was, they had a better chance of doing those kinds of things by living in town. The picture you see here is one of us. That's actually my brother on a horse, and we all learned to ride very early because that was also a tribal thing. My parents, still on the reservation but miles away, stayed in this house for a period of time, a place called the Dryhead Ranch, and this was the first place that they did their sheep operation. This may sound like it's not part of growing up on the Crow Reservation, but we're still on the reservation and you're still dealing with tribal people. What's important to know is that on the reservation, a certain portion of those lands always belonged to tribal people. So you had to lease. So to lease, you had to have good relationships with tribal people. They were really your landlords. Even if you bought and owned some land, you still were having meetings and relationships with your landlords from the tribe. Occasionally, because of it being a sheep operation, we had other residences like this one. This is a sheep wagon, and if you were far enough out following the sheep, you would maybe stay in this. At those times, the smallest of us kids would sleep in the same sheep wagon with the parents under the table, which was under the bed. The table actually pulled out from under the bed. As the older kids got a little bigger and there wasn't really room for them in that cramped space, they might park another sheep wagon next to it, and that would be where they would live. Although the wagon was really designed for one person, you could make it work that way. If you're wondering why I'm presenting all this old history, it's because the way of life in the summers didn't change much from what it had been 50 years prior. Much of this is key to understanding that the underlying culture of both the Crow people and the long-term non-Indian residents like our family was a product of what had gone before. It's a different way of life, and the best way I can describe it is like living in another country. I was saying this earlier. The reservation has its own rules, its own laws, its own government. And so if you're on the reservation, even if you own land, you are a guest. And our parents always emphasized that to us, that we were not there to take over or to be in charge of anything. We were the guests of the tribe. I'm not sure some of the later arrivals understood that. It's not a concept that people are really comfortable with, but that's how it really does work. And if you do that, you get along fine and you're there, you know, you're really kind of part of the fabric of the country around you. It's a sovereign nation, and we, the white people, were always a minority population growing up on that particular reservation. I don't know that that's the case in some of the other reservations. I'm only speaking about the Crow because that's the one that I really am familiar with. The reservation schools were part of our lives. All three of us, my brother, my sister, and myself, were graduated from Lodge Grass High School, as our father had been. We were guests and our parents insisted we abide by the rules. In the immediate post-World War II years, there was a sizable white population within the town of Lodge Grass, but as the years passed, more and more white people moved away for any number of reasons, and the tribal population's demographics moved back to an even stronger representation. By the time I was graduated from high school, the lower grades were in the range of 6 or 7 Crow children to every white child. Many of my friends were Crow, a lot of them descendants of my dad's friends. It's a nice little picture of my parents in front of the teepee of this lady. She's one of the longtime friends and also longtime landlords, if you will, of my parents in their ranching business. Her name is Mrs. Bird Faraway, which I think is a beautiful name. My parents made sure we were all three of us kids were aware of and respectful to the traditions and events of the Crow tribe. We attended Crow Fair, and that has grown into a huge, huge event now. I'm going to show you an overhead shot, which I hope will bring a gasp. Those are all teepees and tents of people at the Crow Fair. It's just a huge, huge event. And it was pretty big when we went in our childhoods. And we were there for dances and ceremonies and lots of other things besides the Crow Fair. This is a little bit of a blurry snapshot. The white child on the far right of the picture is me, and the others are family friends. Again, because of the way lands are handled on the reservation, we owned about half of our home ranch and supplemented its area with leases of land owned by various Crow families. Lands were originally assigned to individual Indians who passed them down to their children. Often members of the tribe would be our landlords. So when we were leasing these big tracts of land from them to supplement the rest of our ranch, we might have as many as 20 to 30 owners of the land by that time, because the descendants and their descendants became the landlords as the individual Indian to whom the lease or the land was assigned had inherited it. So if you ever are dealing with a landlord somewhere and you think it's really something to have to get one signature, let me tell you, we had many, many visitors come to the house, tribal visitors who came to do lease business with my parents. And as it got fractionalized down by the inheritance of generation after generation, let me just give you a glimpse into it. For the sake of math, if the lease cost you $1,000 per year and there were 25 heirs to the land, you might be writing a $40 check to each of them. Sometimes they like to collect it piecemeal through the year. So then you would have to keep a set of books to track all of that until you hit the $40. So that's a math simile. It could be more or less than that, depending on how many families there were who had inherited that particular piece of land. An important part of the culture was that these folks liked to stop by our house for a visit when they collected their lease money. And that was a really wonderful exposure for all of us in the family. My parents always had a big pot of coffee and cookies waiting for people on these occasions, and they might come and spend a half hour to an hour with you. So that was really a great way to be exposed. This is a very small slide, but it's the only picture I could find of the school at Lodge Grass as it existed when I was a kid. They've built a totally new school now. But going to school on the reservation had a different feel to it than some other small town Montana schools too. In the years of my childhood, the language spoken in many of the homes of the kids was Crow. They were native speakers. They still have preserved their language, but now because of Head Start and television and a lot of other things, they are much more articulate in English. In my day, some of the kids came to first grade with little English and learned it in the classroom. For some, it was difficult enough that they might have even had to repeat first grade. And, you know, at the time, you really couldn't look at a kid like that and say, gee, they aren't very smart because they don't have English. They were becoming bilingual. They had more languages than most of us did. So that was another thing that my parents impressed upon us. It wasn't easy for those kids to make that transition, but they did it. The other side of that is, as a kid growing up on the reservation as a white kid, if you didn't know the language, it was really easy for those kids to switch and talk about whatever they wanted to talk about, possibly including you, in their own language, and you wouldn't have any idea of what they were addressing and talking about. So that aspect of school, all the way up through high school, was there. And if you had people who had moved into the area from other places and they were white and didn't know anything about the Crow culture, they sometimes struggled with the idea that it was okay for those kids to speak the other language. The saving grace, and it is for many, many small schools, but for tribal schools, I think all over the state, this holds true. The saving grace of high school is basketball. As you may know, high school basketball is almost an industry on every small town, but particularly on the reservations. The parents and grandparents are dedicated to the sport, and the teams are usually very skilled. During my young days, there were no girls' teams. There are now, and they're brilliant. They're really wonderful athletes. But in those days, it was just boys. Their achievements were a deep source of pride for the whole tribe, and particularly the relatives of any individual kid. Some writers have compared the dedication to the forays to basketball games as similar to the old times when tribal young men would go out in hunting or war parties, and the rest of the tribe would follow along to reap the benefits of that. When it came to tournaments, it was not unusual for the entire town to shut down in order to attend. Kids started shooting hoops when they were barely able to walk. None of this little kid equipment for them like we see now. If you were 2 years old and you could handle a basketball, you better be able to hit the regulation height of the basket if you wanted to score. The Crow people had a huge influence in our lives all the way around. Many of them bought and traded or sold horses to us, and also to our grandfather before us, and many of them had grown up with our father. My grandfather, my father, and my brother were all adopted members of the tribe. We counted many of them as family friends, and there was seldom a day when a native person didn't come to our house. As I noted before, those lands of the Crow country are enormous, and parts of them today would seem isolated and almost unreachable. In the day before so many other activities, it wasn't too uncommon for people to hop in a vehicle and drive 40 miles out to where you were staying with the sheep to visit you. But in this day and age, I don't know that so many people would do that. There were some beautiful evocative names of some of those areas on the reservation. Point Creek Falls, Woody Creek, Lemon Springs, Gold Hill, Eagle Springs, Reno Creek, Cashin Creek, the Dry Head, Windy Point, Black Canyon, and the Big and Little Elk Canyons come to mind. To give you a feel for the vastness of the country, here's a pretty vast herd of sheep, and you can see beyond them miles and miles. It was good sheep country, and all of us went with our father in the summers when he went to the secondary ranch that he ran the big herds of sheep on, because he needed that much space for grazing. At the height of our sheep ranching, our dad was one of the 4 sheep partners with an outfit called the Antler Land Company. And at that point in time, there were 4 partners. Each partner had more than 12,000 head of sheep. So we kids learned a lot about the sheep business on the reservation as well. But many of the people who worked with us and for us during haying to harvest food for the sheep, and during shearing when we harvested the wool, and during lambing, were tribal members as well. They were dedicated workers. We really had wonderful relationships with those employees. Um, these slides are kind of historic in a way because very few people run that many sheep anymore. But for us, that was just a part of our childhood. I was talking about people who would brave the roads to come see us. Some spring roads were not necessarily inviting. This is a kind of a strange soil over there that they call gumbo. You've probably heard the term. It's a silty clay-like stuff, and it's got the consistency of wet biscuit dough. It'll stick to everything it touches, and it's almost, well, it's not impossible to get off, but it takes a lot of work to get it off your vehicle. My dad often said riding a horse through gumbo would result in your horse being a lot taller at the end of the day. The other thing was there weren't a lot of bridges on some of those little creeks that I named earlier, so you might have some interesting crossings, and sometimes you didn't quite get across. But people were hardy and they were willing to come out and say hi to us, and usually you planned a little extra at any meal to be sure that they got fed when they got out there, because they weren't going to just drop into some restaurant on their way home. It was big distance. Again, taking a look at this, you can see the size of the country. In addition to the foothill country, which was where we spent a lot of the early parts of the summer, and the sheep were down in the grazing areas in spring and winter and fall. The summer was spent in the Bighorn Mountains, and again, vast country. Here's a picture of my father, and we always got to go along and help with this sort of thing, moving a sheep wagon to another spot where somebody was going to be camped for the time being. These are those high mountains I was talking about. They don't look high because they're very flat, but some of the elevations are in the 9,000 to 10,000 foot range. And consequently, you could get caught in the winter with your sheep wagon, and you better be kind of ready for it. You can see the sheep all kind of waiting for the herder to take them out to someplace to graze. The grazing leases on top of those mountains were really big too. The flatland house was more like this, or else we were using the sheep wagons, and a lot of times hired men stayed in this house, and we stayed in the sheep wagons. So that was part of what how you constructed everything. This particular ranch was the second ranch for us, our summer ranch, if you will, and it was very primitive. There was no electricity, no telephone, still on the Crow Reservation, but way out in the country. So kerosene lanterns provided the light. A hand pump delivered water for baths, laundry, cleaning, dishwashing. Drinking water, though, was hauled in big barrels because it wasn't the greatest quality water. And of course, there was the ever-present outhouse, reached by a path along which there might or might not be a rattlesnake. Some summers we did stay in the sheep wagon so that the house there was used for the cook. I still marvel at the fact that 4 months out of my life every year was spent in an alternate universe that felt more like the turn of the century. We had trucks and tractors, but we also continued to use horse teams, again, a function of the gumbo dirt and deep snow. In addition to the richness of the experiences that I've already described, our elementary and high school in Lodgegrass had this low percentage of white children. And it's a gift that each of us 3 kids in the family have always been grateful for. It was the most natural thing in the world to have a member of the Crow tribe be a friend, just as natural as it would have been to have a white kid. I won't say that we are completely oblivious to the differences, but you just had a greater degree of acceptance, I think. And it served us all very well in our later lives. So in summary, what did growing up on the Crow Reservation contribute to all of us? One of the things it gave us all was a gift of storytelling in one form or another. In our family, you can mark it up to tradition or Western heritage, but for us, it's a lot more. Our whole family came from an Irish American heritage on our dad's side, with famine immigrant great-great-grandparents. And as a result, that is a culture that's very involved in storytelling too. The Crow Reservation is a place of immense storytelling because for many years they only had oral tradition and oral passage of their language down to the next generation. It's only been in recent years that work has been done on preserving that language in written form. So the tribal people, when they would visit us, would tell a lot of stories. We heard a lot of the tribal legends. We heard a lot of just stories about their everyday lives. Storytelling is really embedded in all of us. And then the cowboys and the sheep herders who came and went also were great storytellers. It was a wonderful way to enrich our downtime in those days because we didn't have, as you can see again, in that place, we had no television. We had radio that ran on a battery, so you didn't run that for very long. And so that's a lot of what happened in terms of growing up on the reservation. Some of you may wonder if I still go there. Yes, I do. I still go back. I try to go back for the Crow Fair every year and try to pay as many visits as I can to that area. I have left a fair amount of time open for questions because a lot of times I don't know everything that people want to know about my childhood. So I'm open to any questions that any of you may have. If you have any curiosity about, otherwise I'll start talking again. So you're probably better off to ask questions. I can't have told you everything. I know that. Anybody?
Well, unmute, go for it.
Well, I'm not sure that you brought up any questions and stuff, but you sure brought a lot of reminders, memories myself on there. You're talking about the language being used, and I was very pleased to see that also. But when I went on in to gather information from the water resource there at the agency and stuff on there, that halfway through they'd start talking Crow, and and they, wait a minute now, I got to start all over again here.
Yeah.
But I thought it was really neat, and like I said before on there, I truly enjoyed my time in meeting the people there.
Yeah, it's really, as long as you are open to it, you can have just a wonderful time there. Other questions?
Lorretta?
Yes.
In that last slide, I was wondering, is that the ranch that had a natural springs that you could utilize?
No, that one had the creek that ran through there. It's a creek called Beauvais Creek, and it was the water from the wells, the water from that we could get out of the land there wasn't good. The ranch that you're thinking of is the main home ranch, which had all kinds of hot springs. It had a hot water well that was an accident, came from people drilling for oil, and produced a 90-degree, 90-pound pressure and about 95% pure water. So we were very blessed with that. But the ranch that you saw, the old one, that did not have good water at all. We had to haul the drinking water there.
Just in like a wooden barrel or a plastic barrel?
Wooden barrel in the early days, and then later, you probably all remember the old milk cans. Yeah, that was oftentimes used for water too, because it was a little bit more durable.
So did you learn the language?
Bits of it. It's one of those languages that a lot of it is based on pitch. So it's not so much learning the vocabulary, but how to use the vocabulary with the right tone of voice to get the meaning that you wanna get, because just a little tiny change can mean something very different. And then emphasis is very different. The one that always sticks in my mind is there's a word that means over there. then it's Ithaca. And if you want to say it's way over there, you say Ithaca. Same word, different pitch, different emphasis. And a lot of the language is like that. So yeah, and the kids, you know, love talking about the other kids with that language. I wouldn't call it a form of bullying, but it was kind of funny because your name never got translated. So, you know, they might talk on along and then all of a sudden say, Lorretta, da 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 da. And you're going, what? And you didn't have any idea what they might be saying. Could be good, could be not.
Did you get a chance or see any of the sign language, the prairie sign language that was used fairly common?
Yes, my dad and all of his friends, whenever they came, would talk that. I'm going to divert just a minute. Karen, I knew your aunt. She just mentioned that her aunt was one of the missionaries down there. She and Miss Olds. Hi. Yeah, that's a link for you. I knew them well. In fact, one of the two, and I can't remember. I think it was Miss Olds gave me piano lessons. So
Actually, that was probably Malvina.
maybe it was.
Malvina played the piano, but Clara was the driver. She was always the person that drove the two of them around.
Well, they should have you on to talk about that history. That is so
Oh,
fantastic.
we've donated most of the stuff to the Hardin Museum, and so there's a whole display on them down there
That's
for people
excellent.
to see.
They were, how shall we say, they were very brave and strong ladies. That was really cool that they, you know, the two of them were the Baptist missionaries at the Indian Baptist Church, as I recall. And in fact, my sister and I, a few years back, went to the Lodge Grass Cemetery and visited their plot too. That was just really sweet. Lovely ladies. So thank you.
I was
Go ahead,
kind of
David.
surprised that one of the churches over here in East Helena in recent years, well, shoot, recent years to me is, you know, starting about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
On it, but they missionaried down there, and I got to talking with some of them down there, and they were coming up to visit the church here in East Helena that weekend on it. But I was really quite surprised. There's a lot of very religious people down there, and I think, you know, the ones that live it, not
Yeah.
just talk.
Well, they're pretty dedicated. All their churches are pretty dedicated groups. They really grasped onto that, and it's kind of interesting that the Crow, to deviate a bit from growing up on the reservation, but just a little bit of history, because of their relationship with the white citizenry, they still got treated a lot like the rest of the tribal people, but they got a bigger reservation, and they were more comfortable. Like they invited the Baptist church to come there and build the mission. And so they weren't forced to go to some boarding school away. Some of them did, but there was a boarding school right there on the reservation so that they weren't off in Kansas or somewhere isolated away from their families so much.
Yeah.
And a lot of the kids went to the mission school and went home every night, which is not something you always find in the residential schools. So they're a little bit less, there's less trauma memory in that tribe over residential schools.
Yeah, I know. We had one friend here on there that got shipped off to North Dakota, and she passed away here, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, but she was traumatized. I mean, there's no other way to put it and stuff. And she carried that on up into her 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, there's no way you wouldn't. I mean, it was really, they were punished for speaking their language. They were punished for wearing anything that was tribal, and their hair was cut. It's just so many things taken from them that was so bad.
Yeah.
So,
Stuff like that just aggravates the heck out of me and stuff on there.
Yeah, well, it's part of the ugly side of some of our history.
Yeah.
Is there anything that I didn't talk about that any of you are curious about or wondering about what what this was like or that was like, because it's kind of hard to know what people are curious about when you've, like I say, it seems so ordinary to me, and then somebody says, "Oh, that's really interesting." It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I didn't know you'd care.
Well, how was it? Maybe go into a little bit more depth into the fair.
Oh, the
on
Crow
it.
Fair.
Yeah, did you have the friendship dance and stuff on there where you
Oh.
were invited into it by some of the tribal members, your friends and stuff on there?
My
beginning.
dad participated in a lot of that, but by the time we came along, what we had decided, or the family had sort of decided, was that you know, there are a lot of people who are kind of like they want to be Indian, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I hear exactly on it.
So we sort of provided some more spectators for it, but we always visited the camps, and each, in that big picture of all of those teepees and everything, each family has its own space at the Crow Fair, which they call their camp.
Yeah.
And as a result, you go visit just like you were visiting somebody's house in a town, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, yeah.
So even now, I have 3 camps that I visit when I go down there that are longtime family friends, and then their kids were high school friends of mine, or I've made friends with them later in life. And so it's kind of like a huge family reunion. So that's more the function of the Crow Fair for us, is to see that. The flip side, though, Dave, just to address it, we were invited several times, I'm sure because of my dad's relationship with older people, to sun dances, which were pretty sacred then and didn't invite a lot of people to be spectators, but they would invite us to come and watch. And I always felt very honored about that. I still do. And I've not been to one in my adulthood, but as a kid, I was lucky enough to get to go to a couple of sun dances. And I thought that was pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, I was quite surprised at the sweat lodges. You couldn't hardly go any place there without running into them. And I always gave them wide berth because I really didn't quite know. I assumed that they were sacred.
They're at least places of prayer and healing. And so, you know, if you've got somebody who's, I'm sure they've been in full use with COVID. If you're sad, or if something bad has happened to you, or if you want to just pray for somebody who's in the military or whatever, part of the Sundance, or part of the sweat lodge ceremony, is about prayer. And then, as you may or may not know, it's a little bit like some of the Nordic stuff. You do the sweat lodge to where you probably almost can't stand it, and then you come out and you plunge yourself into cold water. So creek, lake, pond, you have to have a source of cold water to complete that whole ceremony.
Or snow.
No, they don't do the snow thing. It's
No,
gotta be,
no.
you gotta be immersed.
The water.
Yep.
Mm.
But yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff, and I'm glad you brought that up, because just a small aside for what it's worth kind of thing is we found that was more common among the Irish in Ireland than we realized. They built their sweat lodges out of rock instead of the hides over branches, but it was the same darn thing, and people get completely overheated in my book and then go jump into some cold water somewhere. So I thought that was kind of fascinating, that seems to be sort of a universal clan thing all over the country and all over the world, maybe.
Did you
Oh.
use sweat lodges?
I have never participated in one of those. I just I don't have a real high tolerance for getting too hot. But one of my dearest friends is a fellow who is a Sundance and sweat lodge. You might call him a medicine man. It's not the real title, but that's what he does. He's also a school teacher at Lodgegrass High School, but but he holds sweats probably at least once a month, if not more often.
You mentioned that your dad and your grandpa and maybe your brother were kind of adopted into the tribe. Was that something reserved only for males or?
I don't know. I don't think so. I've got to ask I've got a girlfriend that I'd like to talk to about that a little bit more. I think anybody can be adopted. And some of you may know that Barack Obama was adopted into the Crow tribe. And what I thought was really cool is the family that adopted him was the Black Eagle family. It was perfect,
Oh,
and he honored that. He, when they came back for events in Washington, he always saw them. He never put them off. He was really good about that. So it's kind of a cool little fragment of their history there. But you really literally have to be somebody that they want to adopt. It's not something where where you could go and say, geez, would you adopt me? They have to decide that that's what they're going to do. Not too different from our adoptions, but
Do they
go ahead.
give you another name, or do you have like?
Oh yeah. Funny other little side story. My father started several AA chapters down there, and they gave him his Indian name, which I have no idea how to say or pronounce. But in English, it translates to Four Flowers. And it was really a nod to the Four Roses liquor, saying, well, you helped us, so we're going to call you Four Flowers. So yeah, it was really, really neat. And then Stan was adopted and my grandfather was adopted. So I don't think my great grandfather was, but the next three generations had somebody in there. And I'm sure they adopt women. I can't believe they wouldn't, but because they're pretty equality oriented. And it is a matrilineal society, so not matriarchal. It's not like the women are necessarily in charge, but all your relationships are related to your mother. In other words, that's the important side of your family. And so I can't believe they wouldn't adopt women.
It's interesting. When I was working over on the Cheyenne Reservation there, that even though we had permission to go down the rivers and survey there, you still go ahead and let people know and ask permission to be on their land, even though you had it already, and let them. But anyway, I went on up to this one house, and there was no adults there, but there was a teenage boy, and I asked his dad was there, and and he said, what do you want him for? And I told him I wanted permission. We'll be down there for an hour or so or whatever on there. And he said, well, he says, maybe you want to talk to my grandma. She owns the land here on it. Says everybody, all the women own the land over here.
Yep. Not unusual.
Yeah.
Not unusual. Any other questions that
It's not really a question, but the accounting side of having that many landlords and how often it would change, like if a parent died or something like that, and all of a sudden, who did the accounting?
my mother.
Oh,
And I still have her books, and I still have those accounting books. I'm not quite sure what to do with them because it's kind of like there's still families down there. I don't know whether you give them to the museum, a nod to Karen here, whether you give them to the museum or not. But she literally used different colors of ink and stuff like that just to kind of keep it straight at a glance. Because, sometimes by the time you got down into the really younger generations, they might be only getting maybe $10, $12 a year out of this lease, but they wanted it and they wanted to collect it. It was almost a ritual in a funny kind of a way. I don't know how to describe it, but doing business this way would make me crazy. But they might want only, let's just say that they had $100 coming, going back to my math example. They might want $5 in January, but getting into Christmas, they might want $25. Again, money was worth a little more in those days, but so that you also had to track to make sure you didn't go way over the $100. It didn't hurt. My parents never minded going a little bit over. You know, it just felt like that was fair because these people weren't getting very much, but you didn't want to find yourself $200 out, you know, because then next year maybe you couldn't give them anything. And it was all part of this whole thing of coming to your house, sitting down in the living room and visiting, talking about what the kids were doing and what the high school was doing and everything else. And at some point in that conversation, they'd say, well, I need to pick up $5 today. And I presume that they visited a lot of other ranches and did the same thing because most of them had other pieces of land. We just, my dad was kind of like, I think he might have been a little bit OCD, but he wanted to be sure that his ranch was square. So there were holes within that were leased land. And he wanted to plug those holes with the leased land to make sure that everything was square. And we had a small ranch, but in eastern Montana, there's others of us here who know what a big ranch is. Our ranch was 5 miles by 4 miles, so it was 20 square miles. And that's a small ranch in that area.
Yep. Well, I would vote for you donating to the museum there in Hardin, the books eventually and stuff on there. But
We're pretty active members of that museum, and I had aunts who worked there at the museum and all of that. So it's got I have a really soft spot in my heart for the place. But it's one of those things that there's some issues of privacy that I have to think about carefully on some pieces of the material I have.
Well, maybe when they open it on up and stuff on there that, you know, you only get to see, you know, 1 page or 2 pages on there. So you pick out that way on it.
Yeah.
I guess the employees could, I guess, take it out and go through it a little bit more, but you know, whatever. I know I tried to get in there a couple of times and I really don't remember. It just wasn't open, and they were redoing something or what have you. Now, this is getting back into the 80s and stuff.
Yeah, they've built a brand new building, huge building. It's very nice now. It's really beautiful.
Lorretta, when did you move off the reservation?
I essentially left the reservation when I graduated from college. You know, I came home for all of my breaks and whatnot. But I guess you could say I really wasn't present all the time during college. And then once I graduated from college, I decided I really needed to have a shock to my system, I guess, because I went to work in New York.
Oh, geez.
Was it a pretty big culture shock just to go to college?
Yes, I have to say yes, because, you know, there were 20 in my graduating class. And I went to Missoula, which at the time had about, I think, maybe 9,000 students at that time. So yeah, that was a shock for sure.
Did you find yourself, like, since you grew up on the reservation and with the rules of the reservation, did you find yourself making, like, I don't know if they'd be called mistakes, but mistakes once you re-entered like a white society?
No, my parents were pretty good about exposing us to a lot of that. And then one thing that I didn't mention, but is kind of also had an influence on me, was that my siblings, both my brother and sister, were a lot older than me. So they'd been out in the world, if you will, and come back. My brother was 16 years older. My sister was 11 years older. So they could also help you understand what you were going to run into when you went to college and went to work in the world.
Did they go to New York also? I can't believe you would do that.
Well, my brother did eventually. He went to the Navy first and then to New York.
Yeah.
My sister, though, stayed in Montana almost exclusively, except for about 5 years in Alaska.
Yeah. Oh, I can go along with that a lot better than New York.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you're a kid, you think, oh my God, I got to see New York.
Yeah.
And because I was too dumb to think anything could happen to me, nothing did.
Yeah. It's amazing on there that, you know, that the good Lord watches out for a lot of us that do stupid things and feel good about it at that time and stuff on there.
Well,
And
there's
I
that
don't
old
really
saying,
mean,
protects the drunks and the fools, and I
There-
think I fell in the latter category.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you
that's-
very, very much, Loretta. This has been really fun.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. It's always fun to get a chance to have a chat with people, but like I say, I'm always amazed that anybody thinks that's interesting. It's fun to talk about, but other people have pretty interesting lives too.